Okay, we're back. I hope you had a good weekend. Usually what happens over the weekend is you've forgotten everything you learned the week before. So that's okay. We'll recap. Okay, so last week our class started in earnest. We looked at the Apology, we looked at the Crito, and on Friday we turned our attention to the Republic. We noted in our introductory discussion of the Republic, in the first of our 3 lectures devoted to this text, that the Republic is not, in fact, manifestly a discussion of politics. It is instead a question about justice. And it turns out that the Republic is an expediency to consider this question of justice. So although the title is the Republic, we might think of it as a philosophy of justice. However, that clearly has a political component, because if we look back and remember what we saw in both the Apology and in the Crito, we see that Socrates lays out this compelling idea that those who live according to a set of laws are governed by those laws as a child is governed by a parent. And so when his friend Crito intervenes and tries to convince him to escape prison and avoid his punishment, avoid his execution, he refuses to do so because he says, I would be creating a world for my children far worse were I to disobey the law than were I to rescue my own life, because fundamentally we need to live inside a world of law. He mentions it, he argues it's essentially a kind of contract that he is forced to obey simply by being a member of the society. And you may recall his notion that the contract essentially exists because you have the choice, at least in ancient Greece, to either stay in the city or to leave, or if you stay in the city, to convince people that their laws are wrong. And so we see from that discussion, amplifying what has already been noted in the Apology, that this question of justice in the state matters a great deal. A just city then creates just, or one of the questions is, does a just city create just citizens, and the like. Although the discussion in the Republic may be about justice, there is clearly then a political component to it. So we saw last time in our beginning of the Republic, we saw the way that this whole discussion gets launched. And I'll remind you what it is that we saw. We saw that Socrates engages in a dialogue, in a discussion with some of his friends, and the key interlocutors here in the first part of the book are Thrasymachus, a sophist, Glaucon, and his brother Adeimantus. And the 3 of them, Thrasymachus, Glaucon, and Adeimantus, put forward definitions of justice that, to say the least, leaves Socrates unhappy or perturbed. We saw that the Thrasymachian argument, the argument advanced by Thrasymachus, was justice is what serves powerful people, right? So justice is what is to the advantage of the powerful. And we saw him further argue that therefore justice consists in the rules that powerful people impose on the weak. It's a kind of conventional definition of justice. Justice is not something transcendental and universal and immanent. It is simply a reflection of power. It is what people in power decide it should be. So if you're living in a world where the rules are being defined by those who are powerful, that's going to be the justice that you experience. And Thrasymachus says, you need to recognize, Socrates, that this is the world in which we live. The powerful decide what is right and what is wrong, and they do so in their own self-interest. He then argues, Thrasymachus, a further point, which is perhaps somewhat complicates these first 2 points, which is he says justice is what creates gains for somebody else. It's not something that creates gains for you, it's what creates gains for somebody else. And we have this problem, how do we reconcile these 2 points? If justice is what is good for the powerful, but justice is what creates gains for somebody else, how do we rationalize those 2 seemingly contradictory points of view? And I think all we need to do is to shift our perspective, that what Thrasymachus is saying is that justice is the rules that the powerful can impose. And if you're living under that system, you're going to perceive then justice as being to the advantage not of you, but of someone else. And the point of that is, therefore, it's not a quality in and of itself that you as an individual should pursue. It is instead a convention or an expediency that serves the powerful, that serves those who have authority. So it's a convention that is actualized by power. That might be a way of saying it. Against this idea, then, we saw that in the first part of that book that Socrates wants to try and make claims for a different kind of justice, a different meaning of justice. And he links it to this concept, and I put it up here on the board, the idea of eudaimonia. It's an important concept, and we will see it again in Aristotle. But essentially, it's a way of capturing a state, a sort of human state. Eu is the Greek for good, and daimon, you may remember that in the Apology that Socrates is accused of worshipping novel daimonia. is the Greek for spirit. So formally means good spirits. But we usually use it in the sense of flourishing, cultivating the good spirits that are within you. It's creating a life that allows you to flourish, to allow you to do the best things that you are capable of, to be the best person that you can be, to be happy, right? All of that. So the idea is that what Socrates wants to do is he wants to link this idea of justice. He wants to move it away from some sort of convention that's attached to a vision of power. And instead he wants to attach it to the individual as a necessary means of the self-attainment of eudaimonia, of flourishing, of human flourishing, of allowing the individual to cultivate that which is in themselves. And as such, and he says this right at the beginning, he locates justice as what he calls a virtue of the soul. You may recall that our Greek word for virtue was arete, that it's a virtue of the soul. And so the human soul, if it expresses itself according to its own excellence, will therefore seek to be justice. And the difference then for Socrates is that justice, when it's simply created as a convention of power, does not then connect to the question of eudaimonia. Instead, in order for us to be happy, we need to be just, because our happiness then comes from our ability for what he calls our soul to express itself in this virtuous way. So in other words, he wants to locate justice as a condition of the self, as something that we have. So that was the first part of the discussion, right? The first part of the book. And then in the second book, you may recall that Glaucon and Adiamantus jump in. They build on this idea of justice, right? They build on Thrasymachus' skepticism that justice is some sort of quality inside of us that we seek to pursue for its own sake. And they provide actually a very compelling counter-argument. They suggest that justice, you may recall, they have the three categories. Things that feel good just for now, things that are feel good now and also feel good later, and their third category, which is things that are a pain in the ass now, but that we do because we know that in the long term they will be good for us. And they ask Socrates into which category he would like to place justice, and he says that it should be in the best category, that which is both good now and good for the future, which then goes back to the idea of justice as part of this question of an arete of the soul needed for our own eudaimonia. If we are just now, it feels good because it helps to make us happy, and it will also bring us happiness in the future. And against that, Glaucon, and furthered by then his brother Adiamantus, say that he's got it wrong, that justice belongs to the third category, that it coerces us into actions that may not feel particularly good, but that in fact we do it because we are concerned about our reputation. And so therefore, justice is something that's about building for the future, helping us to establish a reputation for being just people. And they give the example of the ring of Gyges, which we discussed, the question of the invisible self, that when the self is no longer visible to others, do they have an incentive to act justly? And the answer that they suggest is that we do not. If we can get away with things, we will. And it's only when we feel that we can't get away with them that we are coerced into actions that may or may not approximate to justice. And so then this notion that justice is an expression of the soul needed for our own happiness is, in fact, again reduced back, if you will, to a kind of convention. Instead of convention of power, now it's a convention of reputation. Justice is what we do in order to guard our reputation. And it suggests that if people can't see us doing something, we will not be motivated to do it. So this is then the situation that we're left with. And at that point, faced with that powerful argument that justice is a convention built around the need for social reputation, that Socrates diverts his attention away from what has been up until now a kind of intense discussion of justice at the level of the individual, and he relocates the discussion at a higher level. And that's where we finished up last time. He says we must look for something bigger in order to investigate this question. It's too difficult to do it at the level of the individual. We should then look at it at the level of the republic, at the level of the city. Because a city is made up of people. Therefore, if we can figure out what constitutes a just city, we can essentially infer back and say, well, that's what then constitutes a just person. So the whole motivation, the whole rationale for writing the Republic, for thinking through the question of the Republic, is to explore the question of justice at an individual level, but to make it visible by making it larger, right? And that's what the city serves, essentially as a way of making that individual question visible by bringing it up to scale. So the question then is, and it raises a question that's not easy to answer in the text, how do we make that analogy work? One way to think about it is a city is just when the people who live in it are just. So that might be one way of thinking about it. If all people are just, then the city that they constitute as a kind of political, social exercise will itself be just. Just people lead to a just city. And indeed, we see him sort of saying as much. He says, there is justice in an individual, but therefore also justice in a whole city. And that seems to suggest that the justice of the individual and the justice of the city are somehow linked. At 435e, do we have no choice but to agree that in each of us are found the same elements and characteristics as are found in the city? After all, where else could the city have got them from? It would be ludicrous to imagine that the spirited element in cities has come into being from anything other than individual citizens. So this seems to be a suggestion that the justice that we might imagine inside the state is itself a product of the justice that we as individuals are capable of, that we bring. The just city is constructed from the just individual. On the other hand, he also seems to suggest that the just city can create the just individual. At 434d, he says, the ability of the commercial, auxiliary, and guardian classes, and we'll come to that in a moment, to mind their own business with each of them performing its own function in the city, this will be justice and will make the city just. If everybody does the thing that they're supposed to do, coming together, that creates a sense of justice in the city, and then the justice of the city reflects back on the individual. So we have this idea, is it that we make justice as individuals for a system, or is that we invest justice in the system and it in turn makes us just? That's one of the questions that I think is left standing by the Republic, the question of the nature of our own actions, our own sense of who we are, and the political environment in which we live. For Socrates, it's not entirely clear. The mechanism that exists between the individual and the city is not entirely clear. But there is clearly a link, then, between who we are as individuals and who we are and what the city looks like. So that's the purpose, then, of this book, is to construct a vision of political society in order to investigate this question of justice at the individual level. As such, then, Socrates and his friends construct a city. This is where we finished. And the city that he first constructs, he describes it as a city of pigs. You may remember that we talked about that at the very end of the class. He says, if you were organizing a city of pigs, Socrates, isn't this just how you would feed them? What he means by that is that the first city that Socrates creates, this thought experiment to build a city, he imagines all the things that you need. You need to eat, you need tools, you need some basic elements of organization. And so he constructs a city that includes all the constituent elements that we need in order for our basic survival. So you need farmers to grow food, you need craftsmen to build plows and so on, right? In other words, he fills all those basic needs. What we might call an autarkic city, meaning self-sufficiency. So we can fulfill those basic needs. Food to eat and a house to live in. But that is the bare essentials of who we are, right? That leaves, as he says, no room, for example, for the culinary skills. Fine, we have food to eat. But what if we want the food to taste good, to look nice, right? To be adventurous and so on. We as human beings want more than just the basic minimum to keep ourselves alive. We want to have other things. And this is what Socrates calls a luxurious city. So he says, we are not just looking at the origin of a city, apparently. We are looking at the origin of a luxurious city, a city with luxury, a city with things that are not simply necessary to keep us alive, but in fact to keep us sort of entertained, to keep us happy and so on. And he gives us a list. He says, in the city there will have couches and tables and other furniture, cooked dishes and incense, perfumes, call girls, cakes, every variety of all these things. All of these extraneous things that are not necessary to our immediate survival, but that help to make life pleasant. This is what he calls the luxurious city. He also describes this city as what he calls a fevered or unhealthy city. So one of the questions we have right at the very beginning of the Republic is a city that focuses on creating luxuries for its citizens is a city of ill health, or has the potential to be a city of ill health. So one of the things we find in the beginning of the first part of the Republic is to construct then a vision of a city that both includes these kinds of luxurious goods, but at the same time does so in a healthy way, that doesn't foster what he calls inflammation. The importance then of constructing a city that is not just, as Glaucon puts it, a city of pigs, but instead a city of luxury is critical then to almost all that follows, Because once you move from a system of autarky, you have enough to keep for yourself, into a city of luxuries, suddenly now the city becomes an object that needs to be defended. Now you have something you have produced, and so you're creating things that you want to keep hold of, that you want to protect. You're not just producing the bare minimum. And so from this principle of protection arises then a lot of the subsequent political discussion that he discusses. He says, we have discovered the origin of war. The origin of war is when somebody has something that you don't have and you want it, and so you get some people together and you go over and you take it by force, right? So if you construct a luxurious city, the very fact that you have luxuries in your city means now you have to defend them against those who might take them from you. Hence, a city of luxury is a city that has to plan for conflict, right? That has to defend itself. And so therefore, we build into this principle at the very beginning of the Republic the idea of the city and defense, that the city is something that needs to be protected, needs to be guarded, can't just exist. We have to make provision for how we will protect it. And from there, right, from that simple premise, from that simple idea that a city of luxuries is a city that needs to be protected, follows then this whole discussion. Because once a city needs to be protected, you then create within the city this kind of division, right? You create this potential for power. Who protects the city? How do you protect the city? What are you going to do?
Build walls and train warriors.
Exactly right. That's what you need in your blueprint. Get some walls up, and you're going to have people and train them to fight. If somebody is being trained to fight the enemy, who else can they fight?
The citizen.
They can fight you, right? Give a man a sword, and you've maybe turned him into a passionate defender of the city, or you may have turned him into a tyrant. So the problem is, once you create this principle that you have to protect the city, you have the possibility then that the mechanism for defense turns inward. Instead of being used to protect you from the enemies, it's instead used to allow the people who've been trained in this way to gain for themselves at the expense of the rest of the city. So it's a very critical problem. How do you then create a system of defense that at the same time doesn't also serve to undermine the stability of the city? And so a lot of his discussion follows from that. How do we think about who people should be, who people are, how power should be distributed in the city in order to avoid this kind of a flaw, in order to avoid this kind of a problem? Because at its worst, you end up in some kind of a tyranny. Someone who simply by virtue of being powerful and strong and greedy will end up taking control of resources and subject everybody else to the tyranny of their laws. That's what you need to avoid. Once you've built this mechanism of defense into the city, you then need to have an entire system to ensure that the power that is being distributed is being wielded in the best possible way. From that simple observation, from that sort of simple premise then, some of the things that Socrates elaborates as necessary, not just permitted, but as necessary inside of his city will strike us as quite remarkable. So right away, we have this idea that the city needs to be protected, which means we need to have a class of protector. We need people whose job it is to protect the city. And he has a name for them, very famous, the Guardians. And the Guardians, as a class of people, lie outside or lie beyond then the sort of basic constituents that Socrates puts into his original city. The Guardian goes beyond what you need for that simple autarkic state, that simple state of self-sufficiency. The Guardian is a class above that. They are not producing food. They are not making the sort of instruments of production. The Guardian is there to protect those who do that and the things that they make. So we end up with this idea of the Guardian class. And for Socrates, because of who they are, because of the power and the importance that they have inside the city, therefore, they are the most important class. Guardians must be carefully trained, carefully regarded, carefully understood because of the power that they hold. This capacity to defend, this capacity to wield power. And so at 374E, for example, he calls them extremely valuable instruments. Since the Guardian's job then is the most important, it must correspondingly call for the greatest freedom from other activities together with the highest level of expertise and training. In other words, we need to create a class of people who sort of sit above the rest, whose job it is to defend what the rest of us can do. who should the guardian be? What are you going to want to have in the context of a good guardian? And so for Socrates, he says, well, let's look at the kinds of things that we do. Where must we start the training of our guardians? Where must we start thinking about who these people are to become? And then, as now, right, how do we turn people into what they are? We take control of them in their infancy, in their childhood. We grab them when they're children. And so we start to train them from a young age to become the people they are going to be. In other words, we put the emphasis on education. Education matters in terms of the kinds of citizens that you produce. So you have to be thinking about the kinds of training that they get as children. And so inside the republic, right, inside this model republic, we see this emphasis on how we create the future citizen, right? The nature of training, of embedding education, and not as some ad hoc system of learning, but instead as something that is vital to the state's own interests, something that the state needs to think about as something linked to the state. Here at the very beginning of Western political thinking, we see both Plato and his student Aristotle labeling education as one of the core features of a good state. That a state that aspires to justice is a state that must take educational responsibility. So in the context of the guardians, the important thing then is that the guardian class, that their education be monitored and supervised, right? That they are carefully created. Those of you who've read the text, do you remember some of the things that the children are exposed to, that some of the things that the guardian children have to do? So one thing is, if they are there to protect, right, must they learn how to fight? Indeed. So you're going to need your children to learn how to fight, which means that from an early age, you're going to need to expose them to this principle of violence and bloodshed. He suggests you take the children out and you show them essentially what violence looks like. I can't remember the exact age. I believe it's at the age of 4 or thereabouts. So you take your 4 or 5-year-old and you take them out to some bloody arena to see what it actually is, right? This is what violence consists of. Because that's going to be their life. They are there to defend you. Therefore, they need to be raised in bloodshed. They need to be raised in this sense of blood. Yeah?
Is that really just, though, to force kids into that kind of life?
Well, if you want to have the best guardians, according to Socrates, it is. Yes, indeed. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine your parents at the age of 4 taking you to see some bloodthirsty thing. Doesn't seem very just. But again, for Socrates, the point here is that the power of the guardian is that they have this capacity, and that these are skills that you learn when you are young. So, although to us it offends the conscience, the point is that from his perspective, this is something that is necessary. He also says that the guardians need to be what he calls lovers of wisdom. 375e, he wants him to be spirited and energetic, and by temperament, a lover of wisdom, a philosopher. And so we have this kind of bizarre description of creating in the guardian class these three people: spirited, energetic, and philosophical. Yeah?
So, how do you create in a justice system? How would you choose in a justice system who would be the guardians?
Who gets to choose them?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Well, that's also a very good question. How do you choose the guardian class? Are they simply there? You have to have a system of selection, right? And so the guardian class comes about as a function of a society that knows this is what you need, and so therefore selects people in this way, right? So in other words, it selects people out in order to train them in this sense. Much in the way that we select people to become mathematicians or things like this. It's a skill, right? In other words, it's an aptitude that you have to be part of this guardian class. Let's look at what he says. He says, the guardian is going to be a good, true guardian of our city, must be a lover of wisdom, spirited, swift, and strong. You start looking for the children that you think are lovers of wisdom, spirited, swift, and strong. You reject the weak, you reject the small, and so on. And instead, you look for the people who have those characteristics, and they then form this guardian class. And he says, once you have this idea in place, you need to design an education for these men of ours. Once you have the capacity to select who should be your guardians, you've created a set of characteristics that defines your guardian class, then you build an education system around who they should be. Insofar as the guardians are the sort of highest, the best people in the society, the ones who are responsible for defending everybody else, the principles that apply to them apply to everybody else, but sort of in a kind of paler way. Wouldn't we all like to be spirited, swift, energetic, strong, lovers of wisdom, and so on? So the guardians, if you will, are the best that we have among us, and that's why they get given this role. When we go into this question of education, therefore, the education of these people becomes critical because essentially what they learn, right, or how you teach them, defines their behavior inside the city. It raises the question, do you have the right to control information that would keep them essentially as good guardians? In other words, do you have the right to define what it is they learn and what it is they don't learn? Another way of saying that is censorship allowed? Are you allowed to control what people have access to? Now, today in our society, we think of censorship as something bad, that all people should have the freedom to choose the information that they want. But one of the striking things in the Republic is that Plato lays forth an argument in favor, essentially, of controlling the information that people have access to. You may recall that in the Apology, one of the people that Plato is particularly dismissive of are the poets. Doesn't like the poets very much. So it should not surprise you then to find that in the Republic, Socrates again brings up arguments against the poets, the teller of tales, and suggests that the kind of poetry that the citizen is exposed to needs to be carefully monitored and, where needed, censored in order to avoid the wrong kinds of things coming out. That's difficult for us to understand today because, as we mentioned in our first class, the way we hear the word poetry, we think of lines that rhyme and all the rest of it. But as we recall, what is poetry in ancient Greek society? What does poetry mean?
The telling of history.
The telling of history, right. It defines who you are. So when we are restricting the poets, what we're really saying is we're restricting the kinds of knowledge that we will have of ourselves. That sense of where we come from, how we got here, who we are, and the like. We're going to essentially put limits on, or we're going to get to define the tales that people hear that define their history, that define where they come from. He says we must supervise our storytellers. Those who tell us stories, we have an interest, we have a stake in the stories that they are telling. We don't want people to hear stories that are not good. And the reason is, he says, the young are incapable of judging what is allegory and what is not. That our young people educated in this system, we must supervise the stories they are told, but they lack the judgment to be able to decide what is right, what is wrong, what they should understand, and the like. He said, it's the founder's job, those who found the city, in this case Socrates himself, to know the patterns on which poets must model their stories, or else be refused permission if they use different ones. It is not their job to start creating stories themselves. In other words, the people who are in charge of the state have an incentive to determine what the state gets to hear, right? The kind of information that is allowed to permeate the state, because if you don't, people may spread misinformation, disinformation. They might spread stories that are inimical to the interests of the state. Is it true, for instance, that in our current society, fake news has destabilized our politics? Is that true? Would we agree? That people are getting information off of their Facebook feed, and God be praised that no one uses Facebook anymore except people over 50. But nonetheless, so that's a self-correcting problem. But people are getting false information off their Facebook feed, and they are using that false information to shape their political opinions, correct? And that is destabilizing our political systems because other countries are using this in order to gain geopolitical advantage. Also correct?
Yes.
Therefore, wouldn't it be nice if we could have some system that limits the impact or the spread of that fake or misinformation? Would that not also be desirable?
Yes.
And I think we can all agree that is a desiderata. If we could somehow restrict the impact, the spread of this misinformation, the lies, the slanders, and so on that come across. Wouldn't it be nice if there was an authority that you could trust enough to take up that role? Someone who could decide the information, be able to be an arbiter, if you will, between the things that we should hear because they create good political outcomes and things we should not hear because they create bad political outcomes. In an ideal society, in a sort of an imaginary world where you could imagine that kind of an authority existing, would that not be good? Sure, because then you wouldn't have people coming up with political opinions based on lies, slander, or other fraudulent representations of the truth. So in a sense, what Socrates is doing is very opposite to our own day, because he's saying when we construct our sort of ideal city from the ground up, when we build up this imaginary city, we have to recognize that that people are not responsible in how they consume information. They don't exercise good judgment in how they consume information. Therefore, the principle of controlling or limiting information should not be left to the individual. We cannot trust their judgment. Instead, we must locate it at some higher plane. It has to be at some greater level that authority is wielded. Otherwise, bad information will come into the city. And if a poet, as he says, persists in telling the stories that we do not want them to tell, or that we do not want our citizens to hear, we will expel those poets from our city. And indeed, he's not very happy about poets in general, because most of what poets tell is not truth, but allegory. Some kind of vaguely described thing in the past that only has resonance through allegory. This is not what Socrates wants for his citizens. He doesn't want them to think through allegory. He wants them to think differently. So the whole mission, if you will, of poetry for Plato is problematic. He's saying, in an ideal city, we would include a mechanism of censorship, which we respond to saying, well, censorship is always bad. We've identified, if you will, that the threat from censorship is greater than the threat from misinformation. But that doesn't mean that misinformation is not dangerous, particularly if you don't trust individuals to make good judgment. And that's essentially what Socrates is telling us. We all agree, if we could extirpate fake news, as we call it, from our political discourse, we agree that we would have a better political society. Isn't that essentially a form of well-meaning censorship? And so perhaps we are in agreement after all. Yeah?
Then in an ideal city where everyone's just, you wouldn't need it.
Yeah, and I would imagine that for Socrates, a city that's constituted in this way at some point will no longer have to censor the poets, because those poets will simply not be there. Exactly. The just city realizes its own justice, right? But first we have to get it moving. Hence we have the role, as he calls it, of the founders. Those of us who are constructing the city as part of this exercise.